Okay, as Andy mentioned, I have had some involvement with EAWA, the African-Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'd also just like to acknowledge my co-author, Andy Blackmore, who I'm sure as some of you know is excellent at translating science talk into language that even a lawyer can understand. So he's been very useful. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is just very briefly introduce you to EAWA, then talk about some of the challenges that have been identified in implementing this agreement in Africa, and I'll try to focus on Southern Africa insofar as I can. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the mechanisms that have recently been developed at the international level in order to attempt to support African countries in improving their implementation of this agreement. So to begin with, what is EAWA? As Andy mentioned, it is a treaty that was developed under the framework of the Convention on Migratory Species. It entered into force in 1999, so relatively speaking, it's still a fairly young international instrument. South Africa's been a party since 2002, so since the fairly early days. The overall objective of the agreement is essentially to get range states to take coordinated measures to maintain migratory waterbirds in a favorable conservation status or to restore them to such a status throughout their flyways. The picture on the slide depicts the agreement area, which, as you can see, is fairly large. It is the largest agreement area of any of the CMS agreements. And you can see that it covers most of Europe, parts of Asia, even Canada, Middle East, and the whole of Africa. The agreement does provide protection for over 255 species of birds which are ecologically dependent on wetlands for at least parts of their annual cycle. And in terms of the kinds of protections provided, the agreement obliges parties to take a number of general conservation measures, so things like ensuring that any use of migratory waterbirds is sustainable, managing any threats to these species in general, securing a network of suitable habitats for these species throughout their ranges. But in addition to that, a set of far more elaborate obligations are created in respect of what are considered to be priority species, which are listed in terms of EAWA. And these more elaborate obligations are included in a legally binding action plan. As I've indicated on the slide, the action plan has sections on a variety of different issues. Just to give you some examples of the kinds of legal obligations that it creates, it obliges contracting parties to develop legal measures to, for example, prohibit the take of certain species completely, to regulate the modes of take of other species, to develop and implement international single species action plans, control non-native species, phase out the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands, ensure that impacts on waterbird populations and their habitats are taken into account in the EIA process. And also there are various obligations concerning monitoring listed populations, carrying out survey work for areas about which not very much is known, etc. So there's a fairly long list of quite ambitious obligations included in that action plan for priority species. But despite all of these various obligations, you do find that for many species of waterbirds within the agreement area, their trend status is worsening. And in particular, we found that implementation of the agreement in Africa is lagging behind implementation of the agreement in the rest of the agreement area. So one particular problem is that even though Africa makes up a significant portion of the EAWA range, as you can see from the slide, only 27 African countries are actually party to the agreement. And you can see that there are in particular gaps in, or particularly serious gaps in membership in Southern Africa and Central Africa. Now that doesn't mean that EAWA can't continue to provide some kind of framework for facilitating cooperation in conservation activities in that area. So for example, just quite recently last year, the EAWA Secretariat facilitated a workshop in Southern Africa for all Southern African stakeholders for the development of an international single species action plan for the Slati egret. So it has provided some framework for cooperation even amongst non-parties. But the problem is that if a country isn't a party to the agreement, it doesn't have any legal obligation to implement its provisions. And this essentially translates into gaps in effective implementation within the sub-region. Even amongst countries that are parties to EAWA, various problems with implementation have been identified, and I'll just run through a few of them. The first is lack of adequate legislation. So even in South Africa, we've spoken a lot in the past few days about South Africa's conservation laws, and yes, South Africa does have some very comprehensive conservation laws, particularly in comparison to other countries in Africa. But there are still gaps from an EAWA implementation perspective. Our conservation laws don't provide protections for all of the species that we're required to protect under EAWA. They don't, for example, deal with all of the modes of take which we are required to regulate. They don't restrict the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands. We've got very comprehensive EIA regulations, but in practice, impacts on migratory waterbirds aren't always taken into account in EIAs for developments that may impact these species. So there are gaps in our laws even. Another problem, even where there are laws, there are problems with enforcing these laws in a lot of African countries. Also problems with there not being enough legally protected areas of significance for EAWA species. And even where areas are protected, problems with them not being effectively managed. And this was raised earlier today in one of the other talks, this idea of legal protection not being enough to achieve effective management. In addition, Africa has made the least progress in developing and implementing international single species action plans, which are a really important conservation tool, or an important conservation guide, rather, for coordinated actions for particular species along their entire flyways. Again, just to take South Africa for an example, at the beginning of this year, there were 4 international single species action plans that were applicable to South Africa. In our most recent national report, we only reported that we're implementing one of them, the one for the white-winged flufftail. Okay, so there does seem to be some room for improvement there as well. And then other problems also linking to lack of systems for collection of harvest data and lack of regular and coordinated monitoring and surveys. An additional problem that is quite serious is that a lot of African countries have not been complying with their reporting requirements under EAWA. Okay, so EAWA requires all parties to report on their implementation of the agreement every 3 years. Now, in the last reporting period, only 36% of the reports that were actually due from Africa, from African countries, were submitted, as opposed to 92% compliance in the rest of the agreement area. We're also seeing that out of those reports that are submitted, a lot of them are incomplete. Okay, and this includes South Africa's reports. So if you look at South Africa's most recent reports, there are a lot of gaps, particularly when it comes to details on species status. I think that this can partially be attributed to the fact that the EAWA reporting format has recently changed. Parties are now required to provide a lot more information than they were in the past, so there's a far heavier burden on countries than there was in the past. But if you look at South Africa's most recent national reports, we reported that there are 73 EAWA-protected species occurring in South Africa. A lot of these species, as I said, we didn't really provide a lot of information on their status. So if you take an example of a species that has been presented on in this conference, the wattle crane, the only information we provided in the report was that the species occurs in this country and that it's native to South Africa. Okay, so there are questions in the report format on, population estimates, trends, etc. And information wasn't included on any of those issues. Now, it doesn't mean that the information isn't there. I mean, as we've seen in this conference, there is a lot of research surrounding this particular species. But it does mean that somewhere along the line, the information isn't filtering up into the national reporting process. So I think there is possibly room for more dialogue between the national and provincial levels in this regard in order to try and improve the information that we're providing. Just sticking with the same example, another thing I'd like to point out is that, as many of you will know, the wattle crane is a TOPS listed species. Okay, so it is protected through South Africa's national legislation. But that's another issue that hasn't been reported on. So there's work going on the ground, there is legal protection, but those factors aren't being reflected in the international reports. And so it's creating the impression that we're doing less than we actually are in terms of EAWA implementation. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of some of the problems that have been identified in implementing this agreement in Africa. So what's then happening at the international level? Well, the meeting of the parties for the agreement, and the meeting of the parties is essentially the agreement's governing body, has recognized that there is a need to boost implementation of EAWA on this continent. And as a result of that, in 2008, it adopted an African initiative, essentially an initiative aimed at coordinating and improving implementation of EAWA in Africa. The very first step that was taken in this regard was to create a post for an African coordinator on the EAWA Secretariat. So we now have a woman from Cameroon. She's the only African member of the EAWA Secretariat, and she's dedicated to dealing with she's dedicated to coordinating the African initiative. She's been set a number of tasks. The first of these is to encourage African range states to actually become parties to the agreement. Okay, because remember that slide with all of the gaps in membership, particularly in Southern and Central Africa. And so the Secretariat, as a result, has held workshops for non-parties. It has even made trips to countries that are not party to the agreement, has held meetings with government officials, and this is seeing some success. You know, if you just look at Southern Africa, Zimbabwe became a party this July. Swaziland will be a party as of December 2012, and Zambia has also begun the domestic processes necessary for ratification. So we are seeing some improvement in that regard. And just to run through the others quite quickly, she has been providing advisory services to African parties. So, for example, she's provided assistance in drafting funding proposals, which has managed to generate funding for a number of projects. She's been working on enhancing cooperations with other relevant MEAs and organizations that are doing work in Africa, and then also in promoting the EAWA Small Grants Fund in Africa. So the EAWA Small Grants Fund is a tool that was operationalized in 2010. So far, it's only been used to fund projects in Africa. Unfortunately, South Africa isn't eligible for funding under the tool. We're not considered to be poor enough. But most other African parties are able to apply for funding of up to 25,000 euros for EAWA-related projects. And what's quite an important aspect there also is that non-parties can also apply for limited funding if it is for projects that will assist them in preparing to become members of the agreement. So that is potentially a tool that can be used to grow membership within the sub-region. Then, quite an important focus of the African Initiative, which I'll run through very quickly, has been the development of what's known as the Plan of Action for Implementation of EAWA in Africa. And essentially, what this is, it's a plan of action that was finalized and adopted in May this year, so it's very recent. And it is a plan which is meant to guide implementation of the agreement in the period between now and 2017. It's structured according to 5 objectives. Each of these objectives then has a set of targets, and each target, or under each target is listed a series of actions and expected results. On the slide, I've just tried to give a very basic summary of the overall objectives and targets. Okay, this is trying to condense a 50-page document into one slide, so it really just is the basics. But you can get a sense that the objectives, yes, they do focus on improving conservation measures and sustainable use, but there's also a strong focus on improving the knowledge base that is needed as a basis for future conservation action. And in addition, also a strong focus on enhancing the capacity of countries to implement various aspects of this agreement. And in that regard, just to give you an example of the kind of activities that are anticipated or that are envisaged to occur under this action plan, they include things such as assisting countries to identify gaps in their legislation, assisting countries in identifying important sites for protection, workshops to build capacity, pilot projects on things such as community-based natural resources management, research projects, etc. There's a very lengthy list of activities and a very ambitious one. In fact, if you look at the estimated cost of implementing all of these activities, it comes to well over 9 million euros. Okay, so realistically, we're not going to be able to generate that amount of money before 2017. And that is taken into account in the plan of action. There is some prioritization of activities. And it is also envisaged that when it comes to the implementation of these activities, there needs to be emphasis placed on collaborating with existing projects and programs of organizations that are already working on wetland conservation and waterbird conservation issues in Africa. That the coordination of those partnerships is going to be a task of the EAWA Secretariat, which is also going to be engaging in fundraising activities in Europe, hopefully generating funds for as many activities as possible. And then the French government has also committed to dedicating a team of experts in one of its research centers to assisting African countries and providing them with technical support in implementation of this agreement. So there is a fair measure of international funding and international support that is anticipated. Okay, and in my final 2 minutes, the last issue that I just wanted to highlight is a tool that wasn't actually developed under the African Initiative specifically, but it has been identified by the Plan of Action for Africa as a tool that needs to be used in order to improve implementation in this region. It's a tool called the Implementation Review Process. It was developed in 2008. And essentially here, the idea is that an IRP case can be opened whenever there is a significant threat to an EAWA species or to a species habitat or any other significant breach of the agreement. And the idea is that once a case is opened, the EAWA Standing Committee will engage in discussions with the government of the country in question, will determine what the problems are, what measures are being taken at a domestic level in order to prevent or mitigate the threat in question, and if need be, actually offer to send out a team of experts to conduct on-site assessments and make recommendations as to how the threat can be prevented or mitigated. Okay, so you can see very much a facilitative approach, trying to assist parties to pull themselves into line with their obligations under the agreement. The one point that I want to make about this tool, however, is that it is a process that can be used by NGOs. Okay, it is permissible for NGOs to propose IRP cases to the EAWA Secretariat. So, for example, the most recent case that was initiated by BirdLife Bulgaria. It involved a wind farm project which had undergone an EIA process, but BirdLife Bulgaria felt that that process was defective in various respects, including the fact that it wasn't based on sufficient data concerning collision impacts, etc., didn't take into account cumulative effect of this wind farm and other wind farms in the area, and a number of other problems with that EIA. Now, the reason that I'm raising this example is that when you look at the South African position, and when you look at the current climate in which our government is under a lot of pressure to enhance our sustainable energy base, you're starting to see some quite controversial examples of developments that are being authorized on the basis of fairly questionable EIAs. And one particularly controversial example would be the development of the Thomas River Wind Energy Facility in the Eastern Cape, which was authorized without any investigation of the potential impacts of that development on flighted animals. Instead, the environmental authorization simply instructed that there be post-authorization monitoring of impacts on these animals. Okay, now, obviously, if there were that kind of development, and it was a development which had the potential to significantly impact AWA-listed species, and the government took that approach, that would be a clear breach of its obligations under the agreement. And in those instances, under this implementation review process, civil society would now have an avenue to at least raise the issue at the international level, rather than only having to use the public participation tools available through our EIA processes, which, as we know, aren't always very effective. Okay, so I think that I've used up all of my time, so just a few brief conclusions. What I've tried to show is that there is a desperate need to improve implementation of this agreement in Africa. As I've just discussed, if there are significant failures to implement the agreement, there are processes for NGOs to raise these issues at the international level. There are also mechanisms being developed to support countries and African countries in particular in improving implementation. But ultimately, and the final point I'd like to make is that if this African initiative is actually going to be a success, African states and African organizations need to take ownership of it and need to be actively involved in its implementation and in making use of those opportunities which are available. Thank you.